Hopefully everyone had a great lunch, and hopefully everyone had a great morning. Let's start the afternoon sessions, right? Oh, you didn't? Oh, shucks. So SuperNova South is really excited to bring two superstars. We have, and I'm going to read the names, Matt and Drew. They are from Akka, which got very recently acquired by Salesforce. So these guys know what they're doing. They know how to do usability right, and they know how to make it work from a small business to a very large business. So give a very nice warm welcome of Atlanta to Drew and Matt.
Thank you. Is this working? Everybody hear me okay? Not working? Nope. I was afraid of that. That better? Hello? Hello? It's down here, but it's definitely on.
Can we do this? I'm going to call.
Does yours work?
This battery calling down.
We can just yell, not that. You can hear me okay? Yeah, when we just get started, we can speak up.
Yeah, we'll just yell.
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yep. All right, let's go.
All right, so Matt and I are going to walk you through a methodology that we use at Okta to do design and engineering. So first, I want to kind of get a lay of the room. How many people are in the UX design discipline or research or anything? So you guys are all up here. Is everybody else engineering or some other discipline?
Any engineers? Where are my engineers? All right, cool. This will be easy.
So you guys can correct me, but apparently Matt's going to just be fine. So a little bit about Okta first. We'll basically design and develop on anything that has pixels. So that includes websites, mobile apps, wearables, Internet of Things devices. And we always go through a full design process. That includes research, requirements gathering, design definition, branding, and then finally it goes over to Matt's team for the actual engineering. And like I said, we've kind of developed this methodology that we use that we found works really well to talk to not just amongst ourselves, but also different people at our client's office. So we'll walk you through that. Maybe one last question for you guys. How many people do consumer apps versus enterprise apps? Is anybody doing kind of B2B systems or anything? All right. Okay, B2B to C. Seen a lot of that white labeling. So one thing that's always important for our clients to understand when we're talking to them, they think they need a new, let's say, billing system or support system, and they don't think about design. The biggest thing that we have to push them towards is design is actually really important because people that work at companies are also consumers of things, of these different devices. And so design is really important, and it's everywhere in the products they use at home. So you need to bring that design into the workplace, even if it is just a B2B application for, say, filing expenses or something. Design's still really, really important. The biggest hurdle there is that they see a lot of people, younger people coming into the workforce, and they expect these systems to work a certain way. And so if they don't, they look like they're 1990s, which a lot of them do. It actually hurts employee morale and their engagement with the company as well. So IT always has these promises that you're going to have all these great systems. We have maybe the best product catalog to offer, the best billing system, the best reporting system. What we've found is they actually don't have very good UX on any of those. The biggest reason is that they're all different silos. So each of them have different product management, different IT support, different product owners. And what that means for the users is that there's a lot of manual processes. So we've seen in a lot of our research, people literally taking something from one system and copying and pasting it over to another one. It's a pretty common thing. And then also, since all of these are tracked and supported and developed differently, they have very competing priorities. So let's say you need to get something that maybe offer a customer support on something that's in the product catalog. Since those are two separate groups, and they're having a problem with the product, the support materials are actually in a different system, and there's a lot of manual pulling and things that get into it. You can't actually smoothly transition into delivering great UX to the end customer. So the answer to this usually has been SOA. I'll let Matt talk through that.
Right, yeah, so traditionally big companies have been splitting up their like monolithic applications into these small little componentized things, services, right? SOA is service-oriented architecture. You guys may have heard of it. And this is great, right, for everything that I just mentioned above. I mean, you're working in separate code bases. You're independently able to make changes to very specific services. Services can self-discover each other. And what you're really looking at here is kind of like the next generation of, taking a monolithic application and breaking it down into these independent components that can be worked on, concurrently, different release cycles. Nothing is really combined into, let's make one big app push, right? We can make a push to the user system, the billing system, the order system, all independently of everything else. So XOA, which like holistically is a design and engineering approach to product development that Drew and I work with at Okta, is strongly based on SOA. But with a few differences and issues, right? So if we look at what's happening here is usually your interface is talking to a user system. Maybe this is your authentication, right? And that's also talking to an order system, which, okay, so I've placed an order for something in the product catalog. That order system is talking to the billing system to do the credit card authorization and verification. All that's great, but independently defining and developing these individual systems has some issues.
Yeah, and the biggest one is, since their ownership is shared across them, there's never a cohesive user experience across all these different tools. I mean, how many marketing people or product managers usually know what the term SOA even means? That term is not even something that they speak. But IT uses that term, and usually when they say it, they mean it's a huge, big re-architecture. It takes multiple years. And the problem is, if they're re-architecting based on lots of different requests from different people, it's just going to take a long time. You're not even going to be sure you're actually doing the right thing. You're not supporting the right kind of use cases. And then also ITs they're always struggling with keeping the lights on projects, so they have to support and maintain the current software as well as work on this new software and this new architecture. And that's something that basically means the new stuff is never done correctly.
So what is XOA? What is this design and engineering process that Okta has employed in order for us to create and then engineer fantastic user experiences? So again, holistically, XOA is a process. It derives a lot of its technical aspects from SOA. It derives the majority of its requirements from design. So if you take a look at it, I really kind of think about it as top-down design, right? If we take a look at the experience layer, Drew's going to talk about that, but that is your application, right? That is what your users are interfacing with, and for all intents and purposes, that is your product. Unfortunately for engineers, there's not a lot of concern from the general user base on the awesome code that you've written underneath, all the systems that it ties into, all the integrations that you've done with third-party services. What they're interfacing with is the experience layer. That is the UI, the user flow, the overall user experience. So that is where, at Okta, all of our requirements are derived from. Again, it's a top-down architecture. So we've broken it up into 3 different kind of tiers, and we'll talk about each one. We've got the experience layer, experience services, right? So this is kind of that middleware layer that we've implemented, and this is a common thing, especially in SOA. You can sometimes think about it as an enterprise service bus. In a lot of large organizations, this is what they're using, and it's really talking to the underlying data services, right? You've got third-party services that you're using for some data. You've got databases. You've got CRM systems. You've got content management systems. All these kind of system of records that hold your overall data, but they're doing nothing but providing you that data and then pushing it up the stack.
So this should be a pretty familiar diagram or kind of steps for people who are in UX, but this is what you begin with on the experience layer side. So there's first an ideation portion that's mostly to kind of gather ideas, do a lot of this, talk to the stakeholders to get them excited about the process you're about to go through. But then you also have to actually do research in the discovery process. So this is, I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of research that you have to do as part of XOA, because it is a little bit different than UX. From there, you go into taking those research findings and distilling them into requirements that are going to define what you're actually doing. And then designing, so that that's where your wireframes, architecture, visual design all come in. And then it goes over to development. And this process is something that you can do in waterfall, you can do in agile, but basically these are the steps you're going to have to go through every time. So I mentioned the research needs to be done differently. The biggest one, especially as UX people, we like to think user is always the most important above everybody else. But in reality, the users are not usually the ones driving the business process behind it, and they're certainly not the ones making the technology decisions. So since XOA has huge technical dependencies to get these systems out there and actually working and delivering the value, you have to do all 3 streams of research at once. So you have to go talk to the users. This is the typical research, where you're doing interviews, you do observations, you do task analysis. Then you also need either business analysts, or you need to put on a business hat yourself and really understand what the business process is behind the scenes. How are things getting tossed around? Who's responsible for which piece of the process? What is the overall process? Is there process improvement that needs to happen in the software? Or sorry, outside of the software? And then also, how is it being measured? So how's the effectiveness? Is this going to be, if we're talking about e-commerce, is it conversions, or is it getting existing customers to buy more or get upgrades? And then on the technology side, there's a lot of dependencies here. You have to see what they're currently using. There's usually, I don't know, maybe there's a plethora of vendors. They're usually using vendors. A lot of stuff isn't used or built in-house. And a lot of the technology is either overlapping or complementary. So you need to really understand all 3 of those before you can say what you need to do. Now, in a typical UX process, you would skip business technology and say, as long as we're meeting the user's needs, we're gonna be fine. But even that doesn't really help you prioritize. And the priority is really important to XOA because you're trying to speed something through to actual working code and an actual product quicker. You have to do all 3 of these at the same time. So your priorities are always balancing each one. So now that we know, let's say, what we need to do, we've got our prioritized requirements, we're going to start designing and building. So like Matt said, this is a process. We like to start at the experience layer, and we follow a pretty standard UX process. So there's wireframes. Biggest emphasis here, though, is on prototyping. And there's prototyping tools, Axure and Envision, that we use. But it's actually a lot more fun to actually work with the development team to prototype something that's real and start iterating that with users. And that gives you not only what the users want, what they understand, but it starts to give you a way to see what's actually going to be technically possible as we get to it. And the iteration is really key, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. That's a big hurdle a lot of times. And then this is the last part of it, where you're actually putting the visual style to it all. Sometimes the 2 can be combined if there's already a very strong brand, but a lot of times there's not, or in the case you guys are doing B2B2C, I imagine it gets rebranded with each release. So you have to go through the process of understanding how the colors are going to be applied and how that's going to accentuate the different design elements. And one big pitfall that we always make and we always see our clients make, as we're trying to rectify this, is always include marketing in this conversation. Even if you're doing an internal product, there's usually HR or marketing who want to be expressing the company values in a certain way, either to employees or to customers. And if they get left out when it gets time to actually launch or getting close to launch, there'll just be a giant wrench coming in and trying to change everything that you did. And you have to get them up to speed. It just doesn't make for good internal politics. So once you know what you're designing, and you're ready to build, you guys start putting out 2 layers.
Right, so there's really kind of 2 approaches to looking at XOA from an architecture perspective, right? One I'll briefly touch on, that's your Greenfield Architecture. So you're a startup. You have no existing technology stack. You can choose what you want. You can truly derive requirements from design, which is really the core tenet of XOA. This is your best case scenario, and it's easy. Just design it and build it right the first time. Where XOA really shines is building on top of existing legacy systems. And this is a challenge that we at Okta face a lot with our large enterprise clients. They've got extremely large back-end systems that they've been building on for sometimes up to 30 years. And our job is to design and define that user experience and then implement it on top of their existing technology. And that can be really challenging, and XOA has helped us accomplish that. So if we want to talk about that, again, we have to reiterate with the client, this is a top-down approach to architecture, which means design trumps everything. That is where we derive our requirements as engineers. And this is sometimes a hard pill to swallow for engineers. As commonly say, well, this is our system, this is what we should be building on. And too often than not, this is what we can build versus this is what we should build. And that's really the message that it's my job as VP of Engineering at Okta to walk in and say, guys, I get it. I understand what your system's currently capable of, but the research and the design has shown that this is what it should be. And quite frankly, if we're going to be kind of bounded by what we're capable of, this project could be a waste of time and resources. So a lot of what happens is we will go into an existing architecture and we'll do kind of a gap analysis. What do you currently have? What data can you currently expose? What services can you currently expose? And how does that fit into the design and requirements that have come down through that top level process? Anything that's left is a gap, and anything that's left that's a gap we need to build to. And so commonly what we'll ask is, let's not rebuild the entire system, but let's augment it. And whether that's shimming in an experience services layer, whether that's modifying an existing enterprise service bus, these are all the options that really, when we push forward IT, this is kind of how we mitigate we're going to need to redesign everything, and it's a 2-year process, and we're going to have to start from scratch. And that's the exact opposite approach that we want to do with XOA. It's all about time to market and delivering that user experience that is ultimately the true value of the product. So how do we build in earnest, right? How do we minimize that time to market? How do we work on top of the existing legacy architectures that are out there? And this is where we talk about the experience services layer. And this, quite frankly, is what we're seeing a lot of the enterprises out there either don't have or don't have it implemented in a way that allows us to really create the user experience that's on top. So what we'll build is essentially this piece of middleware software that's going to talk to both what's on top of the stack, the experience layer, and what's at the bottom of the stack, your core data services, right? So this could be anything from existing databases that hold user information. It could be cloud platform solutions. It could be content management. It is truly, like we said before, this kind of core set of data that powers your application but doesn't define the experience. And what you want to build is application-independent APIs, right? If you're building a user authentication API, don't tie it to a specific application, right? Make it as generic as possible while still meeting the requirements that are set forth by design. Data aggregation, right? Make one call, let the experience layer make one call to the services, and let services aggregate all the data from your disparate cloud or database or legacy systems underneath, right? So it's combining that to populate what's going to happen at the experience layer. Extensibility, right? Write it generically. Use it again. Code reuse is a major thing. And when we're talking about the experience layer, it could be one application or it could be a suite of applications. So it's very important that you write things to be extendable and reusable. And then finally, this is, in my mind, one of the coolest one is core architecture abstraction. So what does that mean, right? If you're building your experience services on top of your data services, you've got one interface here. You've got the ability then, when you want to make a modification to, like, let's say it's your content management platform, and the flavor of the month in one of these enterprise applications or one of these enterprise companies is Adobe Experience Manager. We see this a lot, right? Some person in IT made a big investment into some large platform, and for political reasons, and usually more than technical reasons, they're asking us to build on top of that. It happens all the time. And we're happy to do that. But we're going to build it in a way where we're abstracting it, right? You can kind of think of it as the experience services as almost like a data adapter. What we're saying is okay, we can consume from your content management system, but we're going to do it in a way that is not going to affect the overall user experience. And if you ever want to swap out to the next flavor of the month, you're able to do that kind of almost hot swappable just by modifying this middleware layer. And so there's a lot of power there in system migration and getting off specific vendor platforms when and if that time arises. So again, we go back to if experience trumps engineering, how do we build for the impossible? And this is something that I hear, from giving this talk a lot is, well, UX doesn't talk to engineering. What if they design something that we can't build? Well, first off, UX people, get to know your engineers. I mean, we're pretty nice people. And you will be amazed at the input that we'll be able to have into the process. And if that happens early enough, you're going to save yourself a ton of headache down the road. At no point in time should UX literally just toss the wireframes over and say, okay, go build engineering. That is just going to result in a lot of project backups and a quagmire of technical difficulty.
Since you guys might do that.
So how do you do that, right? And this is something that Drew and I, again, as head of design and engineering, that we come in and worked out a process, from the very beginning. It's design engineering touch points all through the process. Well, design may be agile or upfront, or agile or waterfall upfront. There's still a lot of engineering touch points and integration, right? So do design walkthroughs with your engineers. Talk to them about what you're designing as you're designing it. Let them plan. Let them architect for what is going to be eventually coming down the pipe. And should there be some requirement that has some technical risk, right? Run a feasibility study. As an engineer, look for third-party solutions that may be able to meet that requirement. And if it does meet that requirement, does it meet it within the time and scope of the project that you're currently working on? Obviously, those things are really important. And then finally, prototyping. Drew mentioned it earlier. It's absolutely invaluable when you're working with, it could be a really cool user interaction, but you don't know how performant it's going to be. It could be a massive amount of data that you need to shrink down and get just the relevant pieces to display on a mobile device. So it's got to be, your data packet size has to be very small as you're going across perhaps even a cellular network. Prototype it. Get something out there that is workable that you can say, okay, we can support this design requirement. Let's keep moving forward.
So I try to slip a cat into everyone, but I think this cat actually, if you've ever rolled out a new piece of software, you've seen somebody that is totally this cat. That they were not involved in the process, and their world is changing. Everything about what they're trying to do is changing, and they don't like it because they weren't part of it. So while design and engineering are obviously critical to XOA, because we're able to deliver things faster, it gets more complicated on the organization side. You have to manage that change. Now, if you're at a company big enough, you probably have change managers. That's an actual title that people have. But if not, it's probably going to fall to you or you plus a product owner to do it. That involves things like planning for training. Who is going to have to use this? How are they going to use it? What are they currently doing? And how's that going to change very specifically for them on a day-to-day basis? You also have to get support across the whole organization. Somebody in IT is going to have to be supporting the tool or maybe iterating the tool that you're building and designing. And the best way to actually get the users on board early is to do pilot and beta tests with them and iterate with them. Even if they're not even the real software, if you're just doing the interactive prototypes, they're still much less likely to have that sort of a reaction to what you're doing. So once you're done, your organization is ready and you're preparing, it's very important to actually celebrate the launch. And by celebrate, I don't mean just send out an email saying, hey, welcome to the new system, because that's usually what people do. Since you had to work with all the disciplines, you had to work with engineers, you had to work with business stakeholders, with change management, with other designers, it's really important that you guys come together as a team and actually celebrate it. Because at the end of the day, you're not actually over. Because we're trying to deliver something quickly. It's not going to have all the features and functionality it needs. It's not going to necessarily be competitive or on par with the system that you had before. So you're going to have to keep iterating. You don't want to celebrate too much and just stop development or stop design. You just got to keep going. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of one of the case studies that we've actually applied this to. It's a higher education institution, and I'm sure, is anybody here in education? Okay, so you've probably, does your school have really good systems? They look like they're modern? No, that's, okay, fantastic. I wonder if it's one that we did. That'd be nice if it is. This institution basically had a lot of tools that look like, again, they came from the mid-90s, early 2000s if you were lucky. And the students were actually using them because they didn't really have a choice, but they were actually seeing pretty high usage of it at first. And these platforms were all from different vendors. Some of them were built in-house. And they were all very robust in terms of functionality. So they would actually do everything a student technically needed to do. So requirements-wise, the student was able to do everything. But what actually happened was that since they were built so piecemeal, students had begun not using them as much as they should have. And we started seeing things happen, let's say in the admissions process. There's literally between 9 and 12 times somebody would have to write their first name into a form field just to apply to that school. That's a huge problem when you really need to. That's a big stressful life decision that you're making, and if you just have to get hung up on little things like that, it makes for a really bad experience. And that just affects admissions. If you take that further into the current students that they had, a lot of people are on FAFSA getting financial aid. And that has to be renewed, and you have to renew it before you can register. The systems that were doing that, there was about 4 different systems that somebody would have to touch just to register for classes and get through their financial aid. And none of those systems talk to each other. So they were seeing people that would forget to renew their financial aid, and they would literally have to drop out of college because they forgot something. That's how bad the systems were designed and not talking.
Right, so as Drew mentioned, a typical student was managing several accounts. And this is my favorite example of what not XOA is, right? So there was no middleware tying all these disparate systems together. They had, again, a financial aid platform. They had the user management platform. They had everything from a course catalog. These were all very disparate systems that did not talk to each other. So they had no service that really would kind of aggregate and combine that data. So the user experience was incredibly disjointed, right? And so what we did is we walked in there, took the XOA approach, let the design team define the requirements of what should this continuous user experience be, And as an engineering team, we went in there and applied the services layer across all of their systems and got them one fluid, basically from I'm thinking about going to college to I'm enrolled and I start the next day. In a lot of ways, you can kind of think of what this was as a conversion funnel, right? I mean, if you're on Amazon.com and you're browsing for products and you want to purchase it, they've nailed it, right? I mean, even if you got one-click purchasing turned on, it is the easiest way for you to spend money and essentially get the product that you want. This is very analogous to what this university wanted to do, except their conversion funnel was incredibly broken. Their user experience was incredibly disparate. And imagine if you had to go to Amazon and then log in or enter a piece of information 11 different times before you could actually check out and get your product. That's what was happening here. So through design, through technology, through XOA, we were able to create one continuous user experience. And on top of that, they actually had a great deal of self-support frameworks out there. So the unfortunate part of it was they were incredibly hard to find. Again, you had to log into 10 different systems in order to access them. And their support costs for actually calling up the university and, again, getting financial aid information or getting signed on to a system or looking at a course catalog were incredibly high because there was absolutely no continuous user experience to allow a person to find what they needed to do.
Yeah, so just to recap the overall process, I'm going to go through maybe this case study too. So during ramp up, we had to look at their student journey from the beginning, from when they first were inquiring with the college, all the way through when they were alumni. So everything that happens in between then, that obviously involved a lot of different types of research, a lot of different types of people. So for example, the students, we found out the biggest thing about that being a big stressful life decision, and the tools were actually making it harder. That was a big user finding, and so that was the user need for something like XOA, for these systems to talk to each other. On the business side, like Matt said, they were spending a lot of money acquiring new students, and I don't mean acquiring as in a customer, but literally to get somebody on board, registered through financial aid, a very expensive, very in-person, manual-intensive process. On the technology side, they had databases everywhere, especially with marketing databases. Now, customer engagement, understanding when somebody came in, how they came in, if they've already talked to someone, is extremely important. They would have situations where a student would be calling in who had just applied to school, and the advisor on the phone couldn't actually see their application because the advising system that was phone-based didn't talk to the other system. But if you walked into a campus, their system did know that. So the communication of the user was really broken up by that technology. And then again on the business needs, so we found out, we ran the math. Like Matt said, it's basically a funnel. You can put dollar signs to almost all of these interactions and figure out where most of the money is being either wasted or where the cost can be cut or where you're just spending a lot more than you need to kind of per student. And what we found was that was actually in the admissions process. So because they do so much marketing, let's say they send out maybe 2 million emails to somebody, and X% of those will respond. The only response that they could actually accommodate was a phone call. You couldn't actually go online and do any of it. So if you can eliminate either that phone call or the need for the phone call to be so long, you're going to enable the advisors you have to handle a lot more student volume coming through. And so that's where we started. We started with admissions, with those tools around picking your degree, planning for your future, getting financial aid together. And that's what we've done quickly. So from there, we did the definition, the planning for it, and we started building and learning.
Yeah, and so as Drew mentioned earlier, and that animated GIF where somebody comes and beats the racer at the very end. Build, measure, learn, iterate. Get your product roadmap. Understand what you're actually going to be putting out at a specific time, but understand and all those features are based on the research and findings that come out of the design, right? So this is what our stakeholders and our customers have determined is the most important. And that's what we as engineers are going to build for, within a specific time and scope of the project. But that doesn't mean that we just, drop it and move on, right? There's V1, V2, V3, V4. Your product roadmap can stretch out as far as you want it to, and it's this iterative process of build, measure, learn, and deliver, and then essentially repeat, right? So build the requirements that have come in for your version 1 through design. Measure them based on, instrument your application. Get the analytics that the design folks can then take back, do the research on, determine what is not working, what is working, learn from that, and just continue to deploy the process. It's truly kind of the quote-unquote agile methodology of continuous delivery.
I'll give you one example on the learning. What we saw was students that were coming to the application, they were actually adding between 5 and 8 degree programs that were not within the same schools. So it's pretty clear that they didn't actually understand what they were doing when picking degrees. They were looking for career advice, which is a whole different level than an actual degree program. So that data showed us that we actually need to build a career finding tool next to help them get all the way through the process. That's just how like instrumenting your application, like Matt said, can help you figure out which feature to work on with using real numbers as the basis for it. So how can you bring XOA to your organization? I think first of all, you have to be able to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Get out of the release schedule that you're probably familiar with now. Get out of the current scope of what you're trying to do. You have to really build that design-led perspective in yourself before you can take it to your organization. It's design-led, not just design. So design should be leading it, but it's still going to involve all of the other people. You have to start talking to them. And then you have to also be valuing all the different types of research. You have to talk to the business stakeholders and involve them. You have to talk to the engineers and involve them. And since we're trying to get something, again, to market sooner through XOA, you have to document not only what's needed for that first release, but what the larger picture is. What's the larger story or larger value that this product is going to deliver over time. So I think that really means it comes down to you don't think about features or systems, which is virtually all we think about most of the time. So features, you don't want to say, for example, that when somebody clicks this link in their email, it takes them to this system, and on that system is where they can look at a map of campuses, for example. You need to think instead about what they're trying to do. So if you're trying to find a campus, what are the tasks that are involved in finding a campus, and then what data is needed to find a campus, which is very different than taking, again, that features and systems perspective that a lot of people do today.
Right, so if you're looking at goals, if you're looking at fundamentally what is the user trying to do, and that's what's going to be uncovered through design and research, those are translated into engineering requirements. And that's what the engineers are going to be kicking off for their V1 or their even earlier an MVP. But how do you do that, right? Again, so requirements are exposed through design. So if you're working on a legacy system, analyze what you currently have, right? What can you currently support so that you don't need to rewrite it? Again, it's all about speed to market. Find those technical gaps. Now you've actually got stories and requirements to actually build to. So these are the things that you don't have, but that design has said that we need. And again, it comes down to not what we can build with our current system, but what we should be building, for the end user experience. And then build out that development roadmap and priorities to keep the engineering effort moving forward, right? So one of the most useful things that we see as an engineers that come out of design, besides the requirements and the wireframes and all that good stuff, is the product roadmap, right? It shows what we're building to now, but what we're also planning for next. And that's an incredibly valuable thing to have as you're planning and architecting the product, moving forward.
So if you think about how everything is broken into these 3 layers, and if you're working on each of them separately, what that's going to let you do, again, is build something with the user experience in mind first, but also getting something out there quicker. And that's going to result in the kind of the best of breed. So best of breed doesn't just mean the prettiest or the most easy to use. It means the ones that are actually out there delivering some kind of value back to the business. Because you're involving so many different people and you're measuring everything, you're actually mitigating a ton of risk for when it comes to rolling out new features. There's no guessing on how many people are going to use a new feature if you've got data showing that they actually want it. And again, it helps you move a lot quicker than you would otherwise because all these people are involved and everybody's excited. Everybody's kind of naturally wanting momentum to increase. And then finally, by actually architecting things this way, you're preparing yourself for, hopefully you already shifted to mobile, but if you haven't, preparing yourself for wearables, mobile, where the data and data being very accessible is really most important because the experience on the top layer is going to be very different depending on which platform you're in. So we got a lot of time for questions, actually. But thank you in the meantime. Yep.
I'm no developer, but I've worked with a lot of developers. I'm curious about this middleware layer.
Yeah.
Technically, it seems really hard to do. Is it not slow things down?
It will not slow things down in the long run, right? I mean, so what we're seeing a lot in enterprises is the easiest way to start. Kind of the shortcut way is to start tying into these services directly, but that's going to hinder your overall experience. It's going to lock you into whatever vendor is sitting underneath, and that's a big deal. That's where that data abstraction, that data adapter concept of that middleware layer comes, allowing you to kind of switch out what that data store is or whatever that service is underneath without really affecting the overall architecture of the application. This isn't a brand new concept. I mean, enterprise service buses have been around for a long time. It's essentially that. You're writing an adapter to the experience layer, and you're writing an adapter to the data services layer. But it's allowing you to basically create that cohesive user experience all the way across. So yes, will it take time up front? Yes, but it's a heck of a lot less time than rewriting all your services from the beginning.
Yep. And I think the thing I would add to that is since we have a road-mapped user experience on the top, we don't need to rewrite and provide access to all of the data, right. Only the data that we need for that first version. So building them out iteratively that way, not just the iterative experience, but also building the services iteratively helps that a lot.
Yeah, so I love feasibility studies, right? Because whenever a client comes to us and says, can we do this? And we build a lot of mobile applications as well. And sometimes, especially with our startup clients, we'll sit there and say, I don't know if that's technically possible. An example of something that we've built, put in the market, and continue to iterate on is this really cool music application on a mobile device, which will allow us to, let's say, 5 of us had iPhones in the room, and it would allow us to create a social playlist, so everyone's playlist is synced together, and play the audio back in sync, right? So essentially creating one big loudspeaker. There was a ton of technical risk involved with that, right? We didn't know how performant it would be. We didn't know how legal it would be. Can we share that data across devices? So we had to do research there. We didn't know how to architect it with one of the requirements that was it needs to work without a Wi-Fi, infrastructure Wi-Fi. So you could use it while you're camping. This was one of the customer's use cases. So when all those technical requirements came in, the good engineer in us said, I don't know, it depends, let's figure it out. And so as an example, one feasibility study, I think that was probably 6 weeks long, in which we, did a survey of existing tool sets out there. So has anyone done this before? That's our big key, right? Does this exist? If it exists, it can be built. We can instantly say, yes, we can build it. Now we just have to figure out how they did it and then determine if that's the right architecture that we want to move forward with. In this case, it did not exist, in which we said, okay, so let's start playing around with ad hoc networking on iOS devices, and how do we actually create a protocol that's going to allow us to play this music in sync? How do we sync them? Right, so it was kind of teasing out those fundamental technical challenges to the point where we were confident enough to say, yeah, okay, we can build this, let's move forward with the project. Design hadn't started, research hasn't started. These were stakeholder requirements that were given to us by the client, and it was our job to basically give the go, no-go on whether we thought it was technically possible. In lesser use cases, it could be a really cool interaction that comes back from design, in which we say, I don't know how performant that's going to be on a mobile device. I don't know, if this is something that we can build within the scope and timeline of the project. That's another big thing. So feasibility isn't just, is it possible? Is it possible within the constraints that were given to us, in the overall project? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and one thing to add there too, on the higher education, the college example too, we're building out that career services part. So we knew that students were going to not just want, what should my career be, but what's my job prospect? How many opening positions are there now? What's my salary going to be? Is it regionalized? Are they mostly only in big cities? Or are they is it across the country or across the world? And that data actually exists, technically, with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And their API into it, they say it does all these things. So we, without a design at all, just work with the engineering team to come up with, we're going to need these types of data to drive whatever the screen ends up looking like. So they started building that really quickly and found out that the BLS APIs are actually awful. You can't do any of that. So we need to figure out a different way around it. But that was that was probably like a week or two to figure out how to access the BLS API.
Yeah. It's mitigating technical risk by doing your research up front.
Yep. And you can see how that would have been a big problem had we kept going down that path in design. You have this great design at the end. It's like, actually, it'll be 3 more months to implement.
On the engineering side, obviously it depends, but it's usually 1 or 2 engineers focus on that task for, maybe up to 4 or 5 weeks, depending on what exactly we're researching. Thank you.
Yeah, I look at this thing, and the first part that comes to my mind is, well, I can use this for Internet of Things, where the potential experience level may be minimal, but that experience services and the data services become very critical. Am I reading too much into this? And if I'm not, can you give an example of how IoT can be Can you use something?
Yeah, so this gets down to the last point about, we should probably change that bullet from mobile to IoT shift at this point.
Right.
But having the data separate from the experience is all about IoT. A lot of the things that I've seen going wrong with IoT products is they are still silos. They're not being used across, there's like the Nest ecosystem and HomeKit, which are starting to come around that. But a lot of them, like Philips Hue, is still just a single silo here. So the experience is still not going to be as good as it should be. So if you separate out the experience from the data, it'll be a lot better for IoT and be prepared for it.
So I'm sorry if you covered this, I wasn't listening very well. But at one point you were talking about change management and like selling into specific teams in your organization. Like a B2B, your product or your solution may be for not just the end user, but also the people on the team. For example, like a support team that has to deal with supporting an integrated system. So how much of your research, before just having them pilot or beta test, how much of your research goes to that internal team versus the end user? And if you have a conflict, what takes precedence?
I think at the end of the day, the business always takes, so the money always takes precedence in our world. The money and the timeline, because for client services, that's kind of what it's all about. But I think the people you're more referencing wouldn't be involved early in the research. They would be involved before we launch it, though, and before we even are testing it. So I'm trying to think of a good example here. So at the college example, there's the admissions advisors who are now going to have this new admissions tool to use. They weren't part of the original research on finding what the original problems were. But what that did was give us time to kind of get our story completely straight on what the first version of it was going to be. Because the last thing you want to do is sell them this grand vision and set their expectation that this thing's going to be awesome, when really it's only going to be solving the most immediate problems first. So you want to involve them only when you understand what this first immediate implication is going to be. If you do it before, it gets a little messy.
Do you have a dedicated new business sales team, or do you guys pretty much, and then I'm sure you're in charge of retention and on the client services side, but you guys have a dedicated sales force that goes out and finds prospects?
It's all over the board. A lot of our business is word of mouth referrals. We have a lot of existing clients. Yep.
But we do have an account team. A lot of it's inbound, though.
Right.
In fact, the majority of it is inbound. They've come to us through referrals. They've come to us by finding our website or looking at case studies or work that we've done. Speaking at events like this, I mean, that's a lot of how our work comes in. There's an account management team that will then take that, run with it, kick the project off to find what the customer is really looking for and get them in the process.
Yeah, and they're kind of the ones that, with Matt and I especially, figure out if XOA is going to be the right approach for it. A lot of them, get back to this slide here. A lot of people come to us trying to do something really big because big data is almost, I think it's on its way out a little bit because everybody has it. So what's coming next, though, is that, like our chairman says, big data, small ideas. They have the data and they have it in databases and it's somewhat accessible. They definitely don't understand what they should do with it, and it's not really accessible in a way that's going to feed the right kind of experience. So there's been times where we've kind of put our conversations on hold until we advise them through how to build out this layer and how to make this layer accessible. Because without these two, you're not going to be able to do anything anyway.
Right. I love that big data, small ideas quote because it's synonymous with not building what you can build, but building what you should build. And again, that all comes through the research up front.
I was going to see if you guys could expand a little bit more on sort of design and programmers, engineers sort of working together more so than just, hey, throw this over the wall and go build it sort of thing. Maybe if you're in a situation where they're not working really well, how do you sort of like de-ice that? What is sort of like the groundwork for making sure you build a good relationship?
I think since we're all sort of Matt and I obviously work together, our teams work together, the problems are almost never on our side. The problems are a lot of times with I'd say legacy mindset engineering on the client side of things. The biggest way we've been able to get around it, though, is involving them early in the excitement building part of the process. But then also involving them as we're building the proof of concepts for technical feasibility, getting them to understand that this is going to get us on this path that's just really great for everybody. One other thing here that I think is important, if we're doing something in Agile instead of waterfall, what's happening in this planning and building and some of the initial design is If it's in Agile, you should be thinking about it as being directional. So the design is going to go in this direction, or it's this type, it's this concept, and we narrow down that pretty quickly. And then I forget there's a quote from a UX person about most of the design actually happens during development. That's definitely what happens in Agile, because we only have a direction when we start building. We don't have what happens if your username was 2 characters too long or your password didn't work. We wouldn't design that stuff up front. Whereas in Waterfall, that's totally the other way around. We would design every single use case, have a 500-page functional spec, and toss that over the fence to somebody. We've worked in both ways, just depends on how the client needs us to.
Yeah, but process aside, right, it comes down to something really simple, and that's communication, right? Get the engineers involved during the design process. If there's an engineering component to a project at Okta, which isn't always the case, sometimes it's just design, but it's never reversed, right? It's never just engineering. We will always do design. So if there's an engineering component to a project at Okta, there will be an engineer in every single design meeting, usually the lead engineer. I mean, we're not going to pull an entire team off and sit them through the ramp up and the discovery meetings and the visualization and all that. But there will be the lead engineer or someone representative from the engineering team to just be there, absorb it, give input when necessary, talk about engineering constraints that could be present in the current design, how we can modify that to still achieve the same user experience but maybe go down a different path. And it's that kind of integration, those touch points that I mentioned earlier, that has been the absolute key in making sure that everything goes smoothly. And proximity, right? And so Drew's team sits 50 feet away from my engineering team, and that really helps out a lot. There's almost always a UX person at some point in the day sitting next to one of my engineers talking through a wireframe, or vice versa. I mean, and really it just comes down to communication.
That's the places where we're not doing the engineering, a lot of it is actually being done offshore, Eastern Europe or somewhere. It's really important to have either somebody over there in Eastern Europe or somebody on the client's team that is acting as the product owner, who's really the one making those kind of decisions. Because if we're making them, there can be kind of conflicts of interest. Since it's somebody else's engineering team, we don't want to throw any of them under the bus or get them in trouble. So having somebody on the client side to own it is something we push for a lot.
Cool. How about more about your design team? What does that look like?
Yeah, so we have, I forget how, we had 3 people start last week. We've been growing like crazy. But we've got all the different disciplines. We have research, so those are the user researchers. We have business analysts doing the business process and the business research. Product management, since a lot of times our clients don't have product management in the way they need to, somebody tracking the requirements throughout the entire process. Experience architects, so people that make the wireframes. We finally have visual and brand designers. So it's a full suite of design, and at Okta Design, it's much more than just the visuals. It involves the business research as well. It's all under design to us.
Any questions? Yeah, kind of a silly question. Do you guys have an open floor plan? I know designers like to talk, developers like to work. How does that work?
I don't know if so we just moved into our new office a month ago, probably. Yeah. Something like that. I don't know if I'd quite call it open. There are 4 open sections, and then divided with conference rooms down the middle. That's how most of it is.
But yeah, there's no cubicles, there's no private offices. Drew doesn't sit in a palace high above his designers. Maybe in his head,
just
but
put my chair beside, it'll go.
Yeah, so it is incredibly open, right? And we have a really, really cool work environment. Actually, we have 2 floors, and on our bottom floor is essentially just an open kitchen, event space, ping pong, lunch tables, all that kind of stuff to encourage collaboration. Want to make sure that every engineer knows every single designer's name, and as the company continues to grow, that's absolutely imperative for us to keep that cohesiveness. And
booze and free food are always the way to get people to talk.
So there are a couple of parts on collaboration. Some people, obviously, the perception that open space actually creates collaboration, that is true, but also creates distraction.
Yeah. And noise canceling headphones, man. Noise canceling headphones.
I would say when it comes to an actual project, if it's one that can have a fairly dedicated team, if the budget and timelines support that or they need that, we'll get a room that's just a team room where everybody can go in there and work. Everybody can listen in on the phone calls with research. That helps a lot with collaboration too.
So you have developers listen to research?
Sometimes, it depends, yeah. Especially, obviously the technology research are usually the ones leading it. On the business side, though, sometimes too. Yes, yeah, we do have them in users. You have to be careful from what I've seen, where if a developer is sitting in just one, they'll latch on to that one user's requests and needs, and that's the only person they'll advocate for throughout the process. So it does have to be balanced across different users and different types. And the biggest way to get around that is if you can only have them sitting on a one, just involve them in the synthesis of the research. They'll see everybody else too.
Right.
Any more questions, anyone? Well, if there are no more, can you please give the speakers a very